So now we're on Daf Lamed Tes Amud Beis, and just to finish up, we said that the buyer is a chaver, he can salvage and save the mocher by effectuating a chilul ubavi ochma, the kedusha shvius. Now that he's transferred the kedusha from the domim that he gave to the seller onto his own payros, which he has in his house, now the payros are endowed with kedusha shvius. He will have to treat the payros properly, which means he's got to eat them. By the way, it's very interesting. Rashi points out here that not only is he allowed to eat them, but in certain circumstances, he's allowed to use them for other purposes. Even though the pasuk says li'achlo, the word li'achlo means davar shedarko lecho. Let me try to conceptualize it. You're meant to use the payros in the way that they would normally be used. Now, there are some payros that are used for juices, right? You have in Florida, they produce, or California, juice oranges. You've seen them, right? They're usually smaller, they're very juicy. And in such a case, you don't even have to eat the orange. It has kedusha shvius. This can be relevant for us for next year, by the way. You can actually squeeze the juice out of the orange and drink it. Or, for example, Rashi says there's something that's omed l'sicha. Sicha means for anointing. It has a very oily substance. Let's say, for example, certain kinds of olives, they grow for the express purposes of sicha, of to be used for as a what do you call a balm? Is that a good word? Anyway, something. Or, for example, you can use it for hadlok. There are certain kinds of olives that they grow specifically to be used as fuel, to burn as oil. All those are mutter. Why? Because that's dark olakat. So achila in the Torah means dark olakat. What is it usually generally designated? Then the Brisa continues and says, now we have a limitation rule, and that is that belokech min hamufka. We said that if you're buying peiros shvius at a minimum price, less than mazon shalosh sudos, you could buy it even from an amoritz. We're assuming that the amoritz will take these bows, he will buy himself 3 sudos, and he will, in effect, whether knowingly or not knowingly, be mekayim the mitzvah of li'achla, vis-a-vis the damim that are sanctified with kedusha. However, the Brisa says that's only belokech min hamufka, which means that the buyer, who again is a chaver, said, realizes that these peiros were taken from a field that was left open for hefker. And now we introduce another halacha with regard to peiros vias, kedusha shvius, and that's called min ha-hefker below min ha-mishumar. What's mishumar? Mishumar is a field that I lock up, and no one can get access to my field. That itself is a violation of kedusha shvius. Now, there's going to be a machlokas Rashi and Tosafos here, but let's go according to Rashi. If I don't know what kind of fellow this seller is, I know he's an amoritz. I know he's not very super, meticulous. But I don't know that he'll violate the Isur of Meshumah. That far I don't know. So in my naivete, I can assume, until I know otherwise, that it's hefker, that he would not have locked up his field. Aval belokech min ha-meshumah, if the chaver is privy to definite evidence, definite information, that the seller has locked up his field and closed it off, that already puts the seller into a different category. He's no longer an amoritz, bad enough, but he's worse than that. He's called chashud al hashvius. He's already in the category of someone who actively violates shvius. And there, you're not allowed to buy any of his produce, afilu Even if you're buying a very small amount. Why? Because in such a case, this fellow has no reliability whatsoever. So I'll just read to you a summary of Rashi. Rashi says, Sadazu Haisa Mishumeres. If he knows, the buyer, that this field was locked up, it's Mishumeres. Begader, Pesach No'ul, he fenced it and he locked up the gates. Zed Nechshan, now we are choshedim le'inyan Perush Shvius. Sheinu mafkir le'aniyim, he's not willing to allow his Perush Shvius to be accessible to the poor people. And now we have two categories of an Amoritz. Let's just summarize. We have one category of an Amoritz who's stam. Okay, he's not choshed to violate the Easter Shvius. And then we have an upgraded, or if you want to call it a downgraded Amoritz, who's choshed ala Shvius. That means he will violate all the laws of Shvius. He's the type of fellow who would plant during Shvius, harvest during Shvius, sell Pero Shvius, and violate the Easter. Here, the Chachamim said, you're not allowed to buy anything from him. Anything that could have a sanctity of Shvius. Masiv Rav Sheshes. Rav Sheshes now raises the following question on the Bryce. Umin ha-muftar shalosh su'udos v'sulo. If, let's say, I have no reason to believe that this seller, who's an Amoritz, is choshed al Shvius, I have no reason to believe that he locked up the gates and the fences around his field, then you're telling me I'm allowed to buy from him up to, but not beyond, the amount of shalosh sudos, v'sulo, nothing beyond. Uramini, I'm going to ask you a kasha and present a contradiction to this premise from a Mishnah in the 9th parak of Masechet Shvi. Now here, what I'm going to do is, I'm going to read to you this Mishnah in two languages, in Hebrew and in English. And honestly, I understand the Hebrew a lot better than I do the English, but just in case you're an expert, I'm going to read to you the English translation as well. So here's what it says in the Mishnah in Shvius. Pagum. Okay, Pagum, he translates here as Ru, R-U-E. Is there anyone here who knows what that is? Okay, I'm with you guys. If we have a chance, we'll go to Google and we'll figure out what Ru is. But in Hebrew, it's called a tzemach, shenikra rudu, v'hu tzemach mar. It's a very bitter vegetation. Bal prachim yirokukim, and it has green flowers. Next, we get to yarbuzim. Okay, in English, that's called the sorrel, S-O-R-R-E-L. We all know what that is. In Hebrew, it's called chamtzitz. Okay, it's another kind of vegetable. Beha shetim, which is in English called asparagus. Okay, I finally understand something here. Okay. Bechag loglogos, in English is called purslane. P-U-R-S-L-A-N-E. We all know what that is, but in Hebrew, it's called a regilah, which doesn't help me at all. So here I'm lost in both the Hebrew and in English. Vakuzbar, I think it's called coriander, if I'm not mistaken. That's the spice that the Israelis love. I can't tolerate it, but anyway. And then she behorim, it grows on the mountains. Vakarpas. Okay, karpas, in my day, we called it parsley. Let's see what he calls it. He calls it river cress. Okay, we all know what that is. Vagarger shal afar. Okay, this is interesting. Both the Hebrew and the English has the same name. It's called a rocket. In both Hebrew and English. It's really interesting. Anyway, it grows in the grazing land. That's where you'll find. Now, all of these, Pturim min HaMaser. Why are these all Pturim min HaMaser? This reminds me a little, if you've ever davened, I'm saying this is not always the case, but very often, if you daven with Sfaradim on Motzi Shabbos, you'll notice that when it comes time for Havdalah, somebody comes in with freshly cut kuzbara. Where did he cut it from? Does this guy live next door to the shul? But the answer is this Mishnah, it's Hefker. The people are not mocked about these things. And we have a principle called Hefker Potter Min Hamas. Then the Mishnah says, Nikachin Mikol Adam B'Shvius. No one's going to close the field and protect all these roos and rockets. So therefore it's Hefker. You could assume it's Hefker. No one's going to go ahead and lock out people from access to these kind of very inexpensive vegetables or vegetations. It's not protected. In any event, you see clearly from the Mishnah that as long as it's not protected, then you can buy it from an Amoritz. And the Mishnah doesn't give us any cap. It doesn't say, well, up until a certain price, Gimel Seudos. So the impression you get is that you're allowed to you're allowed to pay the seller for any of the above. Again, it'll be prutot, but it accumulates. Let's say you bought the entire list from it, right? And you bought it in massive volume. So it turned out to be more than Shalosh Sudos. It seems like it's mutter, as long as you know it's Hefker. And these things are Mina Hefker. So the Gemara utilized a very famous Talmudic phrase, who most of love, who mafarikler. If Jason's the one who asked the question, he's going to answer the question. Bichdei man shonu. The word man means the amount of food that a person would normally eat in one day. And that's exactly the cap, the maximum amount of money you're allowed to pay the mocher when you buy any of those vegetables or vegetations that grow and listed, enumerated in this Mishnah. Yochanan bichdei man shonu. My mashma, what's the source, the root of the word man? How do you know the word man means 3 sudos? And the answer is the high man, right? So my mashma the high man lishna the mizonehu. How do you know it means the amount of food he needs just to carry him through? The chsiv, because in a pasuk in Daniel, with regard in the context of young fellows that stood in front of the Melech Bavel, it says Vayeman lahem hamelech, and the end of the pasuk says Dvar Yom Biyom. And the Melech gave out to these Na'arim, these youngsters, man. What does man mean? Man means the amount of food that they needed for one day. I have a footnote here I wanted to share with you. It's based on Rashi. He says, "Afopi sheshvius noheges gam begidulim shel hefker." In other words, as opposed to maser, which is potem in a hefker, shvius is chal even on hefker. Who can tell you for sure that the seller did not violate the law and lock up the fields? Nevertheless, we're not prohibited from buying them. Generally speaking, it's not common to guard them and kick out the aniyim. We can assume a chazaka that nobody would have bothered on Shvius, locking up his field, so therefore it's been a hefker. But the maximum amount of money you could pay the Amaretz, the seller, is up to but not beyond Mazon Shalosh Sudos, which is otherwise called man. Does anyone point out that the word mani, it might come from Parshas Vishal? Does anybody point that out? Yeah, but I don't know why it doesn't appear here. Okay. Let me just see if by chance. No. Okay, right now I don't find it. I would have thought that since you're allowed to take man for one day, you can't take for more than one day. That would be the answer to the Gemara's question. Yeah. You're joking or you're serious?
I like linguist.
Real. Okay.
Money comes from man.
Okay.
Because man, you can do anything. Steak, cheesecake, right? And money.
That's good money. You can spend it anyway. Excellent. Okay. There's a fellow here named Moses, and I haven't seen him in a while. Do you know what I mean? I call him John Lennon. No, to me, he looks like John Lennon. Yes, anyway. So he's a great guy, a really sweet guy from Boston. So he's a linguist. He studies, Talmudic and biblical Hebrew from a linguistic perspective. I would like to see it. Anyway, the Gemara is not really clear about our Mishnah. You remember that our Mishnah says that what should you be getting for free from the seller? In the case of Daled Minim, the Esrog. So the Gemara says, I don't understand, if you're not allowed to pay money to an Amoritz who's selling you Daled Minim that have been sanctified with Kedusha Shvius, is Lulav Nami. Why does the Mishnah say that you have to guarantee that you get the Esrog for free, but you're allowed to pay full price for the Lulav? And the Gemara is assuming that a Lulav is sanctified with Kedusha Shvius. So the Gemara answers, Lulav bar shishis hanichnas l'shvius. Fascinating answer. The Gemara is saying that if I go out Erev Sukkot, let's say this year, to buy a lulav, when did that lulav grow? It grew during shishis. A lulav can't grow in 2 weeks. From Aleph Tishrei until Tes Vav Tishrei. It's impossible. Now, this principle is called, just again, I have to write down, because if you'll ever study the Sukkah of Tu B'Shvat, concept of Tu B'Shvat, called Chanot. So, as in Aramaic, we'd say as Linon, Basar, Chanot. So, if you want to determine what year a product that grew from the field is shayat to, how do you classify what year is it? This year, last year? Then it depends on chanota. Now, this word chanota applies to what's called peros or elon. So anything that grows on a tree, we're going to soon see that esrog is the exception. Its status, which year is it relevant to, is determined by chanota. And clearly, if I sell you a lulav this coming Erev Sukkot, the chanot of that lulav took place during shishis. It's not sanctified for the kedusha of shvius. Again, we're going to have a problem going into the 8th year, but now we're talking about the 7th year. Now, what exactly is chanot? That itself is a gigantic sugya. I'm just going to share with you Rashi, a wild sheet of Rashi. It's not here. It's in Masechet Rosh Hashanah in the Sugya Tu B'Shvat. Rashi claims that during the winter months, when the rains fall, at a certain point in the rainy season, in the winter season, the roots below the ground become saturated with moisture. And Rashi says from a certain point and on, the moisture in the roots of the tree has reached the level such that now the tree can produce fruit. And the Gemara Rosh Hashanah records Machlok Beis Hillel Beit Shammai. What is the point of Chanota? According to Beit Shammai, it's Rosh Chodesh Shvat, and according to Beis Hillel, it's Tu B'Shvat, the 15th of Shvat. So let's go with Beis Hillel. So, for example, let's say, when is the harvest season for most of the fruits? Would you say it's July? I don't know, the spring, summer? So I go out and I harvest apples. When did these apples reach Chanot? Months and months earlier, according to Rashi. Probably somewhere in the middle of the winter. And according to Beis Hillel, sometime either before or after Tu B'Shvat. Now, if the particular species absorbed, the roots of the tree absorbed enough moisture before Tu B'Shvat, then they belong to the previous year. If they didn't absorb enough, let's say it wasn't a very particularly rainy season or whatever have you, So the rains came down after Tu B'Shvat. Then Chanukah took place after Tu B'Shvat, and that's the new year for Peres Elon, and it belongs to the new year. So now the Gemara is assuming that if I buy a lulav, the Chanukah of the lulav was during Shishis. Could be I don't buy it in the market until Shvius, but it doesn't have the sanctity of future Shvius. So I don't have to worry about buying from an Amoritz and giving him the full price of the lulav, even if it's a very expensive lulav. The Gemara says, Esrog Nami. Why don't you apply the same yardstick to an Esrog? Bas Shishis, Hanichnesis L'Shvius. If he's selling me an Esrog right before Sukkot, right in the Shvius year, when did that Esrog reach Chanukah, Rabbi? The same time as the lulav reaches Chanukah, which means months and months before. So the Esrog that was classified as a Shishis Esrog. So why is the Mishnah doing somersaults in the air that you shouldn't be paying the seller money for the Esrog? Make sure he gives it to you gratis because it's got Kedusha Shvius. Why does it have Kedusha Shvius? To the same extent that a lulav reaches Chanukah during Shishis, and therefore it's not sanctified with Kedusha Shvius, so to an Esrog reach the level of Chanukah during Shishis. And the Gemara answers, Esrog Basar Lekita Azlina. Wow, this is the major risk. We said that Chanukah is the critical moment to determine the year with regard to Peres Elon. But now we're going to talk about Yerakos, which are vegetables. And the halacha is that in the case of vegetables, Azlinan Basar Lekita. Forget about Chanukah. We're going to talk about Lekita. Lekita means the moment that you harvest it, that you pull the vegetable out of the ground. And the Gemara now is insisting that the esrog, even though it's not a vegetable, it's Peres Elon, it grows on an esrog tree, it has the same identical status in halacha as Yerakos, and it's basal lekita. And we'll soon see that the reason for that is because esrog is a very unique fruit, and it grows not only from rainwater, but you have to irrigate the esrog tree. Without the irrigation, it's just not going to produce the fruit. And therefore, in a certain sense, it's like a yerek. Why is a yerek different than Peres Elon? Because in the case of Peres Elon, you can talk about chanot, as we said before, the moisture coming down from the heavens is absorbed below the ground, subterraneous, in the roots of the tree. Not so in the case of a yerek. The yerek doesn't have roots; it has small roots. You pull a carrot, it's got a root, but the carrot will grow daily depending upon the rainwater. So it's an ongoing process. There's no moment in time when you can say, boom, that's when the yerek reached its fruition. It doesn't have that potential like Peres Elon, and therefore it's leader basal lekita. And since an esrog, like a yerek, depends upon on the ongoing rainwater, and plus you have to irrigate it, therefore it's similar to a yerek. And therefore, imagine the man takes the esrog off his tree on Tzom Gedalia of Shvius, and it's sanctified with Kedusha Shvius. Why? Because the determination of the year, and in this case Kedusha Shvius, depends upon Lekita, the moment that he harvested it, he took it off the tree. The Gemara is not happy with it. But Bein Rabbi Gamliel, Bein Rabbi Eliezer, they can have a machlokas about the din of esrog with regard to other areas of Zraim. But Le'inyan Shvius, as far as Shvius is concerned, they all agree that esrog basar chanot azmin, that esrog is to be treated as any fruit tree, and the determining moment is chanot. And in this case, when he's selling me the esrog on Erev Sukkot of Shvius, the chanot took place months and months earlier during the winter months of Shishis. How do I prove this to you? The Snan, we learned in the Mishnah Bikurim, esrog shaval le'ilan bishlosha drachim uliyerek b'derech echad. Regarding three different halachas of Zroim, of agricultural law, the esrog is classified as a fruit. But with regard to one particular halacha, it's called a yerek, it's called a vegetable. And the Mishnah explains, Shaval le'ilan bishlosha drachim. it's basar chanata with regard to 3 halachos. Number one, arla. So you planted this tree that's an esrog tree. And these are the first 3 years that it produces fruit. And if we want to know whether this particular season belongs to last year or this year, is it basar chanata like peres elon or basar yerek? The answer is that as far as arla is concerned, we go basar chanata. So if this esrog reached the state of chanata in the 3rd year, it's arla ula ravai, and the same for the 4th year, which has kedushas peros ravai like ma'aser sheni. It has to be brought to Yerushalayim and eaten b'kedusha, or you could do a pish ula shvius. And even with regard to shvius, if you want to determine whether this esrog belongs to the 6th year or the 7th year, it all depends on chanata. In what, with regard to which area, which din in Zraim does an esrog have a unique halacha that's like a yerek and as linan basa lukita instead of chanata, is b'derech echad. And here we turn to the top of daf mem. Shebeshas lukitaso isuro. If we want to know which year of the Shemitah cycle it belongs for the law of Maser. So, for example, let's say you're in the 2nd year, going into the 3rd year. The 2nd, every year requires Ma'aser Rishon, but the 2nd year, like the 1st year, requires Ma'aser Sheni. The 3rd year, instead of Ma'aser Sheni, requires Ma'aser Ani. So does this esrog belong to last year, which means Ma'aser Sheni, or to this year, the 3rd year of the Shemitah cycle, which is Ma'aser Ani? It all depends on Lakita. So as far as the laws of Maser is concerned, to determine the year of Maser for an esrog tree, we determine that based on Lakita. But with regard to all the other dinim, including Shvius, everybody agrees that it depends upon Chanata. And in that sense, the esrog is a classic fruit tree. And this is Divrei Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Lezer Omer esrog chavalin lechol davar. Even as far as Maser, we should be consistent. And the esrog depends upon Chanata. So we see clearly that there's a machlok between Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer as far as the status of esrog in Maser, but as far as Shvius is concerned, there was a unanimous agreement that to determine the year, you depend upon Chanata. It's a classic fruit tree. L'chol davar. So the Gemara answers that you're right. That in this particular Mishnah in Masechet Bikurim, there is no 3rd possibility, 3rd sheet. However, there's a brisa, and the brisa introduces a 3rd opinion. And who means the author of our Mishnah that doesn't allow you to sell the esrog of Shvius, because as linan basar likita and not basar chanata, the Amar Ki Haitan. He has accepted the view of a Tana in a Brisa in what we call Tosefta Shvius Perek Daled. Rabbi Yossi says of Tulamos, he's one of the later Tanoim, and he testified Mishum Chamishas Kedim in the name of 5 earlier Tanoim, that Esrog Achar Lekita Lemaser, that the halacha that compares esrog to a yerek, and the determination of the year is lakita, that's only vis-a-vis the law of Maser. However, Rabbi Yossi adds the following testimony: Rabboseinu nimnu bi Usha, and the rabbis in the city of Usha, that's where the Sanhedrin, after it was Gola from Yerushalayim, went to Usha, and there's Canaan there in the city of Usha. They took a vote, and they determined, Amru, that Bein Lemasu Bein L'Shvius. Very strange. I mean, we just were discussing Maser, and all of a sudden, Rabbi Yossi quotes another tradition in the name of Rabbi Seinu B'Ucha about Shvius, that Shvius, like Maser, the esrog tree, depends upon Lakita. So the Gemara immediately asks Shvius, Mandikar Shvei. Who mentioned the word about Shvius? And all of a sudden, Rabbi Yossi in the same prices discussing Shvius. We'll have to add a little piece to this brisa. And let's read it in the following way. Esrog achar lekita lemaser. Right now we're going with the testimony of Tulmus. And we're going to add the words the achar chanota l'shvius. However, as far as shvius is concerned, the determination of the year is chanota, which means it's a classic fruit tree. Oh, now that you've mentioned the opinion of those five Zkanim, now Rabboseinu nimnu bi'usha mi'amru esrog baso lekita beila inyan maser beila inyan shvius. And that means that the Tana of our Mishnah, with regard to the prohibition of paying Yama Oretz for the Esrog, and assuming the Esrog has Kedusha Shvius, the determining factor of Kedusha Shvius in the case of an Esrog is Lakita. And the Lakita was done in the 7th year, and therefore it's sanctified because our Tana holds like the Shita of the Rabboseinu, Shenimnu Be'usha, that in an Esrog, even as far as Shvius, not just as far as Maser, as Linon, Basar, Lakita. Then there are both like this is where we're going to stop for today. And tomorrow, Mitzvah Hashem, we'll pick it up here with Taima, approximately 10, 11 months. Well, either that, or alternatively, you're going to have to make a deal with the seller. And that has to do with also what's called Alter Bezdin. In any event, they're going to have to organize. Next year, you're going to have to figure out what the status of Esrogin is going to be a year from now, because then, if we go Basar Chanata, then it has the status of Shvius. But if Lamaskana, our Mishnah, which is the Stam Mishnah, reflects the Shita Basar Lakita, then it has a din of Shishas, and it's not sanctified with Kedushas. Amen. Everyone should have a great day.